back for part 2 out of 2 of the Intel Alder Lake reviews, at least for now. This one is the 12600K. We already reviewed the Intel i9-12900K. Overall, it was fairly competitive. It had one downside, which was the power utilization, at least at 100% load. And now with the 126, it looks like Intel will be competing more directly with something like the 5600X from AMD, where AMD has a weak point in its stack because it hasn't launched anything cheaper for a very long time, since the 3000 series at this point. So we're gonna look at the 126 today. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Crucial and its Crucial X6 portable SSD. We use these external SSDs all over the office for rapidly transferring games and files between systems. The X6 comes in 500 gigabytes, 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, and 4 terabyte capacities with USB-A or USB Type-C for the cable. For a high-speed and high-capacity external drive from Crucial, click the link in the description below. As we said in the 12900K review, a couple of basic things. If you want to learn more about the architecture of Alder Lake, you should check out our previous piece. We'll link that below. We're not going to go into deep details on the architecture in this video. We're focused instead on the performance of the CPUs. The architecture basics has got two different types of cores. There's E cores, there's P cores, that means efficient and performance, and then there's a total thread count as well, so hyper-threading is still active, at least on some of the CPUs and some of the SKUs. Pricing has the CPUs at $290 for the K SKU, and that's 1K unit pricing, so expect to pay in the 300s for retail. It's $264 for the KF SKU, meaning no IGP. The 5600X right now is around $300, $320, somewhere in that range when we checked before filming. And then you've got the 12900K up in the 600s retail, the KF approaching 600 retail, and the 12700K will be in the 400s or so, with a future 12400, not presently officially announced by Intel, but it's there. And it'll be here in bigger numbers. That should be in the $200 range. So that'll be the true competition. That's the one that we're actually the most interested in seeing, especially with the 5600X, although it remains to be seen if AMD will drop something like a 5600 non-X that's cheaper before the 124 comes out. Anyway, we're gonna look at the 126 today. In our 12900K review, we talked about some of the methodology changes because DDR5 and PCIe Gen 5 are a thing now. They're present on this platform. And we talked about the components we used, why we chose them, and went through some of the methodological choices in the 12.9 review. We're not going to do that again. If you are curious about how we did anything, check that video for more details on the components. For choices on operating system, we used Windows 10. Our defense of that was pretty straightforward. It's something like 90% of the market right now. Fewer than 2% of current users on the Steam hardware survey are on Windows 11. Also, Windows 11 is buggy as hell, especially with Ryzen. And by the way, it's not that much better with Intel. So we do have a Windows 10 versus 11 comparison for the Intel CPUs coming up. We explained and elaborated on the choice of using Windows 10, and that is in the 12900K review. So if you are unhappy with any of that, check that video, and we explain it in depth there. Enough of that, let's get started with the review. We'll get straight into the numbers today. This chart will start with multi-threaded frequency behavior under an all-core workload for the 12600K. Using Blender, we measured an immediate P-core frequency of 4800 megahertz, and that quickly dropped to 4500 megahertz sustained for this test. This went on for the entire 1500 second or so workload, whereas we typically see some boosting and scale back with a reduction of power consumption under Intel's Tau. That's gone with the P cores and E cores, and things have been massively simplified. The E-core frequency ran at a fixed 3600 megahertz for the entire benchmark. Comparatively, the 12900K ran closer to 4900 megahertz for the P-core frequency, again fixed but at 244 watts instead of the much lower 12600K power that we'll discuss later. The 12900K E-core frequency was at 3700 megahertz just for reference. For single-threaded frequency, the 12600K P-core had consistent, simple behavior. The maximum P-core frequency per interval was 4900 megahertz. That means the maximum frequency measured on any given core because of a single-threaded workload. That's flat and fixed, with the maximum E-core frequency at 3600 megahertz once again. The P-core frequency behavior for the 12900K was comparatively bouncy, but much higher overall. The 12600K's power behavior is more consistent. It's also more restrained, resulting in this flatter line that you're seeing. The 12600K testing used the same 360 Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 that we used for the 12900K testing. As we said in the 12900K review, thermals aren't as simple as just testing the temperatures of a CPU and comparing it to other CPUs. And that's especially true if you're trying to compare Intel and AMD. Really, the only thing that matters there is power consumption, and Intel is still higher in that regard. That said, for purposes of gauging the appropriate cooler for a review, this is fine. Our CPU cooler test methodology piece explains this in further depth and what the variables are if you're curious, but otherwise we'll move on. For the 12600K, the 360 cooler is more than enough, obviously. Tested in a fixed 20°C environment, the 12600K maintained a reported 47° average core temperature for the duration of an all-core workload. That's while using the 360 Liquid Freezer 2 at full speeds and with the default ASUS V-Core applied. The 12900K, for comparison, was in the mid-70s for the same test. That's for the same hardware and bench as well, and the software. The 12600K is then significantly easier to cool and would be fine with most high-quality single-tower coolers. This means your effective cost for entry to build a 12600K system is going to be lower than a 12900K system outside of just the CPU cost, because the cooling cost scales down in a non-linear fashion for keeping this product cool versus the 12900. We'll start out game testing with our newest benchmark on the suite, and that's Far Cry 6. GPU bottlenecking is less of a factor with this CPU than it was for the 12900K, so we can get some definitive scaling in most titles, including this one. 138 FPS average is a promising start for the i5, as it's placed between the 5800X and the 5000 series R9 CPUs. The 12600K is 8% ahead of the approximate AMD price equivalent, and that would be the 5600X, as well as last gen's i5-11600K. The extra 4 E-cores are what we think are the contributing factor for this performance advantage. For perspective versus another popular CPU, the 12600K ends up at about 30% ahead in average FPS over the R5 3600. The 1% and 0.1% lows for the 12600K aren't unmanageable, but 32 FPS for the 0.1% is significantly lower than the rest of the CPUs on this chart, at least relative to their averages. This metric was repeatable on multiple test passes and proved to be problematic for the 12600K in terms of getting a clean ranking for this chart. This will be a good one to monitor more closely in our upcoming Windows 11 performance comparison versus the Windows 10 benchmarks for Alder Lake. In the DirectX 12 version of Red Dead Redemption 2, the 12600K is tied with the 5800X at 171 FPS average, and is again right behind the R9 5900X and 5950X. Its advantage over the AMD competition isn't quite as impressive as it is in some other games, like in Far Cry, with just a 3% uplift over the 5600X, but it still holds its own. And that, sadly, is something that Intel hasn't really had in terms of price to performance for quite some time now. Frame times are more stable in this title, and we didn't encounter any stuttering, with lows overall technically better than neighboring 5800X and 5600X components. The uplift generationally is about 4% over the 11600K, just for reference, and that marks a smaller gain than we see in production workloads later, but still a noteworthy one. Red Dead is one of the less CPU-limited games we run, and the dramatic score differences don't really show up until we drop below the 11600K's place on the chart at 164 FPS average. The 3600, for example, averaged 133 FPS, giving the 12600K a 28% lead. The R5 3600 still has headroom for overclocking, but the i5 does too, and there are some interesting new OC options that we plan to experiment with in the near future. Either way, the 3600 is still a good CPU. We think if you like it, if you don't feel like it's hindering you, keep using it because it's good. But for people on older CPUs than this, it may be worth starting to consider an upgrade with Alder Lake, especially since you get on a brand new platform. As we mentioned in the 12900K review, Three Kingdoms, the Total War series game, couldn't make it past the menu screen without crashing in our Windows 10 test bench. We're calling this a DNF, or did not finish, but we have confirmed that it runs in our Windows 11 testing, and we'll have those numbers for you in an upcoming piece. For now, the 12600K also fails here, just like the 12900, and the game is unplayable in its default state with the combination of these CPUs and Windows 10. So this is a unique problem to Alder Lake that we haven't seen on anything else in our current test bench. The 12900K scored exceptionally well in Hitman 3, and so did the 12600K. The i5 managed 185 FPS average here, with lows paced well and proportionally. This is one of the titles that Intel also claimed high generational improvement in, and our results have more or less, to some degree, confirmed that. If we consider the 6-core 12-thread 11.6 to be the 12.6's counterpart, then Alder Lake has a 17% improvement here over the last generation. Although to be fair, the core count has also increased in a way that doesn't match the original 6 and 12 pairing. Compared to AMD, the 5600X allows the 12600K a lead of 13%, more noteworthy than we'll see in some other games. The 12600K also outdoes the 11900K, illustrating a clear architectural advantage and reaffirming that the 11900K was a waste of sand that could have ended up in a swimsuit somewhere instead. This is one of the best cases for Alder Lake thus far. As we've mentioned before though, Hitman 3's results are strongly affected by memory, and we're using a completely different kit with the 12th gen Intel CPUs than with any other tests on this chart. That's a large part of this uplift in this performance, and that's a topic we'll need to explore in more depth with more kits of memory as they continue to come in. Rainbow Six Siege is up now with a 481 FPS average for the 12600K. Our Rainbow Six Siege benchmark proves once again that it's more about measuring scaling between CPUs than it is about trying to achieve a playable frame rate. Clearly, none of these are even close to 3000 FPS, so it's just not playable. Actually, on second thought, anything except for a certain upcoming pre-built, review soon, can play this game just fine. The 12600K is effectively tied with the 5600X, and its 5% lead over the 11600K is in line with what we saw in Red Dead Redemption 2 and Far Cry 6. The 15% lead over the R5 3600 is a smaller gap than in other titles, and you'll see that range expand as we add other games. Of all of the games Intel tested internally, Rainbow Six Siege is the one where it claimed the least generational improvement. So it doesn't come as a big surprise then that the 12600K isn't blowing it out of the water here. This does make the 12900K much less appealing though, so consider your use cases and that some CPUs, as always, may be overly expensive for your use while providing little extra value. Production, however, is another story once we get to those tests. Cyberpunk 2077 has now been updated to the newest 1.31 release. Both Alder Lake CPUs here were strong performers, with the 12600K averaging 173 FPS and tying with AMD's 5900X, although nearly all of the CPUs we tested above the level of the 11400 or the 3900X scored within a few percentage points of each other. 1% and 0.1% lows are steady and in line with other CPUs of similar performance, so there are no surprises here on that category. There's no meaningful gap between any of the CPUs above the 5600X for the most part, at least not with the newest update of the game and with these settings, so we can move on to something else. F1 2021 is up next with the 12600K running at 322 FPS average and with lows spaced as expected. Nothing is unusual here. Comparatively, the 12600K led the 11600K by 9%, the 5600X by 4%, and the 5800X was about tied, albeit with slightly better lows. The 12900K was better, but not in a way that matters in this test, or really any test, at 328 FPS average versus 322. There is scaling to be found here, it's just not much at the high end of the chart. We've been running CSGO benchmarks on APUs and IGPs for some time now, but it's a new arrival to our CPU test suite. It paradoxically replaces Grand Theft Auto 5 as the oldest game in our CPU suite. It's been surprisingly good though, for showing CPU scaling even up to the high end, with the 12600K running at 291 FPS average, or 12% ahead of the 11600K's 260 FPS average. However, this is also a strong title for AMD's 5000 series, unfortunately for Intel. The 5600X pulls definitively ahead at 332 FPS, which is an impressive lead of 14% versus the 12600K. Intel overall has done well generationally, moving 12% over the 11600K, but it isn't as strong in a competitive sense versus AMD. The 12900K was more impressive in this one than the 126. Not only is the stack unmoved by the change from 1080 to 1440 with CSGO, but the average FPS remains basically the same for all the CPUs from top to bottom. That's a good thing. It demonstrates that this is fully CPU bound, even at 1440p, and it shows us the complete scaling of these CPUs against each other. On to production testing. This is where Intel did comparatively and impressively well with the 12900K, more fiercely competing with the 5900X and 5950X than it did in the more closely matched gaming tests. In a Blender all-core workload, which is largely thread-bound, the 12600K ended up at 14.7 minutes to complete the render. That ranks it right between the 5800X and the R9 3900X, both of which are powerful CPUs, and that means that Intel's 12600K is now one of the best value components for this type of workload. To nearly match what was once a $500 CPU and to outperform a modern $387 CPU is admirable. The 12900K leads the 12600K with a 36% reduction in time required in the event you're between the two for selection. The 12600K leads the 5800X by 6.3%, or the 11600K by a massive 34% jump forward generationally. This is what should be happening. Intel has beaten us into submission with changes generationally that amount to often under 10%. So maybe that was part of their plan, to just make any number look exciting, but this one is pretty good. The competing R5 5600X ends up at 22 minutes, not even close to the 12600K, so good work by Intel so far. Chromium Code Compile is next. This one has the 12600K at about 72 minutes to complete the work, making it slightly better than even a 10900K and 29% faster than the 11600K. The R5 5600X required 107 minutes for the same test, marking a difference that is actually experience changing if you compile even somewhat regularly. That's a 33% reduction in time required, so Intel's onto something here. AMD also has its work cut out for it to fight back, and we do think AMD still has that fight in it. So this is gearing up to be an exciting series of CPU generations. Power consumption, of course, will be telling, and AMD still has an advantage there, but more on that soon. In Adobe Premiere with the Puget Suite, which takes an aggregate scoring of various effects, filters, and live playback, the 12600K planted itself firmly at 896 points. That's right between the 5900X and the 3900X, and ahead of the 5800X by 5.5%. In theory, the 12600K should also be cheaper, although it may be a toss-up when considering memory prices and retail pricing. Regardless, Intel is in a powerful position, and this result is a reminder that an E-core is still a real core, and still does actual work. Photoshop also uses aggregate scoring of various filters, transforms, and I/O functions. The 12600K ranked at 1129 points, putting it ahead of the perfunctory 11900K and just behind the 5900X, impressively so. Intel does actually have a promising architecture on its hands, and it's positioning itself to go from strength to strength if it can execute the next 2 years consistently well, but time will tell for that. The 12600K runs 4.6% ahead of the 5600X as well, which would be the closer price-to-price comparison or the closer class comparison. Compression and decompression is where AMD has some power versus Intel, especially in the 12900K review. Here, the 12600K certainly outperforms previous Intel generations in compression at 90K MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, versus a regressive 81K MIPS on the embarrassing 11900K. The 5800X manages to outperform the 12600K, but they're close enough for it to not matter. Overall, the 12600K is still competitive here. Decompression is where we see a big hit. The Alder Lake CPUs just don't scale that well for this one. This is their weak spot. The 12600K now falls below the 11700K and rests closer to the 5600X. It's still doing better than the 5600X, so that's worth something, but you can see a steep fall off as compared to the compression testing. Power consumption is measured at the EPS 12-volt cables, so it doesn't include total system power, but it does get the VRM efficiency losses and the CPU itself. In a Blender workload, the Intel 12600K ended up at 119 watts, planting it right around the 5950X. Of course, compared to a 5950X, that's inefficient, and certainly compared to a 5600X, where it's nearly doubling or just about doubling the power consumption. The 12600K is in a much better spot for performance per watt than the 12900K, which blasted through testing at 244 watts, but AMD undeniably maintains an overall advantage in this metric. At least it holds an advantage when testing at 100% load. Intel may have some advantages in lighter workloads like web browsing or word processing. Overall then, Intel's biggest weak point is clearly power consumption. However, the 12600K is much more reasonable in the mid to low 100s for the power consumption in watts, obviously, whereas the 12900K was something like 244 watts, getting a bit extreme, especially since they've dropped the traditional tau behavior where you reduce the boosting frequency and therefore the power consumption after a window of about 56 seconds. That doesn't happen anymore. It's just 244 watts, period, done with that platform. Now, that is somewhat contingent on the motherboard and the auto V-core that's set by the board, so as we said before, you're going to see it go a bit up and down depending on which motherboard the reviewers use, but that's expected in normal behavior. The 12600K then at the end of this, we think it's competitive with the 5600X. We need to see what the retail pricing shakes out to be. At the time of filming this, the retail pricing is not known. We only have the 1K unit pricing. That's $290. So if it's comparable to a 5600X, the 12600K in fact makes more sense in basically any scenario that we've tested over the 5600X, except for maybe platform level differences where you could potentially make a bit of an argument for, say, moving to DDR5 costing a little bit extra over an existing AMD AM4 platform if you happen to have one. As always, of course, if you are happy with your current CPU, you shouldn't really be upgrading just because something new and shiny and exciting is out, and that's a good side here. Normally, We don't know if it was part of Intel's strategy or not, but they've definitely beaten us into submission with thinking that anything more than a 1% gain or regression is an improvement. But in either case, this is a bit more of an exciting launch. So if you find yourself caught up in that, you look back at your computer, just think about, am I happy with this? When I use this, do I really run into a sense that it's not doing enough for me? And if the answer is, actually, I'm fine with this thing, then keep using it. Save the money, upgrade later when something else is available. But this is a good platform to jump onto at this point. It's much better than the 11 series, where our conclusion was basically, even if you need an upgrade, you should buy something older, because 11 sucks and is a stupid launch. But this is far better. Intel had regression with the 11900K. It was insane. We haven't seen a launch that profoundly stupid in a very long time. And the reason it was so bad is just because it was obviously a perfunctory launch of, we need to get something out there, it has to have the number 11 in it, and we need to look like we're doing something, even if it's regressive and it's reducing the performance, or at least the perceived value, versus the 10 series that came out not that long before it. So the 11 series is a fantastic study in the sunk cost fallacy, and Intel hopefully has learned something from it. The 12 series, however, is a good look for Intel. 12600K, far more competitive than previous launches. It is something we could actually recommend using in gaming systems. And the difference versus the 12.9 in a lot of instances isn't extreme enough to justify the jump in price if you're doing something like just gaming. Anyway, that's it for the 12600K review. Like we said in the 12900K, we did all of this while moving our entire operation to a new location. So it was a couple weeks of hell for us, but we managed to get through it. There's a lot more we want to do with these, including overclocking, including, as we've stated now already, Windows 10 versus 11 benchmarks. We have all of that in the works. Make sure you subscribe so you can check that and check back regularly to catch the follow-up content. This is a pretty interesting platform, so there's a lot to follow up on. But thank you for watching. As always, you can go to store.gamersaccess.net if you'd like to support our in-depth content and testing directly. You can also get something in return, like one of our toolkits, which are on back order now and sell through quickly. So if you want to guarantee you get one next run, place a back order on the store. Otherwise, patreon.com/gamersnexus for some additional content. And that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time.